But I also have a sister. I have two sisters. And I have a sister, Lori, who is very much into psychological interpretations of things. And she loves to try to psychoanalyze our father. Now, I've never particularly felt obliged to psychoanalyze our father. He's just Dad, and that's the way it is. But Lori has, and maybe this is because, I don't know, if speaking to the women in the room, there's a relationship between daughters and fathers that is very difficult to fathom if you're not part of the relationship. But anyway, Lori was constantly trying to figure out our dad. And she came up with this theory. And the theory was that our dad, I wouldn't say he's exactly like Theodore Roosevelt, but he was one who always kept very active. And Lori would say, Daddy never sits down to reflect on things because he'd lose all his momentum if he did so. Now, maybe I'm too close to the situation. I don't think that really applies to my dad particularly, but I'll bet that was in my mind when I was thinking about Theodore Roosevelt. Because Theodore Roosevelt, I'm sure, never slowed down because if he did, that black hair might catch up with him. And he might fall victim to the same demons, as he would have put it, that caught up with Eliot. Okay, so that's the way the Roosevelts deal with this kind of personal challenge. And when I said that in the age of Prozac we might lose some of this, if Theodore Roosevelt had come along 150 years later, at the age of 15 or 18 or 20, he would have complained of depression, and he would have gone and seen a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist would write him out a prescription. Okay, take this. And that would have been the way he would have dealt with his incipient depression, instead of going out basically to conquer the world. Now, I happen to think that world conquerors, the type of personality that goes out to conquer the world, and you decide how the world gets conquered, but the people who go out to do big things are almost, by definition, somewhat unbalanced or neurotic. They're not happy, they're not content, because if you're happy and content, why conquer the world? Why change the world if you like the world the way it is? No, people who change the world are people who don't like the world. And usually the thing they don't like about the world is that somehow it doesn't fit them very well. And so there are two ways of responding to that. One is you can change yourself, and the other is you can change the world. And a lot of people are content to try to change themselves, but some people who have sort of stubborn personalities, they'd rather change the world. Anyway, back to Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt had to deal with the fact that he was paralyzed. Life would never be the same as it had been before. And it's a commonplace among people, especially adults, who suffer a lifelong disability, that a profound depression sets in. And you'd be depressed too, I suppose. I think I'd be depressed if you've been active your whole life and now you know you're going to spend the rest of your life in a wheelchair. And you have to come to terms with that. And you could come to terms with that by changing your expectations of yourself. You go, okay, there are a lot of things I cannot do. And so I'll just concentrate on the things that I can do. Or you can take the attitude, hey, no, this doesn't mean that I can't do things. I still can do everything I was going to do before. And you can just carry on as though it hadn't happened. And you certainly can pretend that you're not depressed. I think that Franklin Roosevelt was on the verge of depression through most of his life, through most of the 21 years after he came down with polio. In fact, I suppose that if I were a psychiatrist, I could probably find symptoms of actual depression there. But here's somebody who refused to let the depression overtake him, who refused to succumb, who acted to all outward appearances as though he was as happy-go-lucky as ever. In part, he felt obliged to do it for the sake of his children, his and Eleanor Roosevelt's children. In part, he did it because, well, he had had political ambitions before this, and he wanted to maintain his political ambitions. And in part because if he pretended that nothing had happened, then it was almost as though nothing had happened. He grew up in what's commonly called the Victorian era. He was born in 1882, and people in those days were expected to rise above challenges. They weren't expected to spend a lot of time contemplating what this all means and coming to terms with their feelings. No, no. Forget your feelings. Just get on and do what needs to be done. And this is what Roosevelt did. People who came to visit him in the hospital, even shortly after he came down with polio, were struck by the fact that he just seemed as happy. He was constantly laughing. He was acting as though almost nothing had happened. When he went into politics, he was constantly acting as though he could do whatever he had done before. And I think Roosevelt, especially after his polio, realized or concluded that if he acted the role of the political leader, then he could avoid having to deal with the personal side of his disability. As long as he could look ahead and look up to the White House, for example, to the governorship of New York first, then to the White House, then he didn't have to look down at his shrunken, paralyzed leg. And when I said that Roosevelt considered himself an actor, he acted the role of president. He also acted as though he wasn't paralyzed. And like the actor Joel Grey, who said, no, it's not stage fright I suffer from. It's life fright. I think Roosevelt had some of that life fright. I think Roosevelt was a person who was more himself when he was acting a role than when he was actually what the rest of us would call himself. Roosevelt kept no diary. Roosevelt wrote letters, but the letters are singularly unrevealing of the man himself. They're just very chatty. Went to this, went to dinner with that, did this, did that. I've read hundreds and hundreds of Roosevelt letters, Franklin Roosevelt letters, and I get almost no sense of what he was feeling, what the basic issues of life meant to him. I can't find him there. He just didn't reflect on this stuff, not in letters. I've read memoirs of everybody who knew Roosevelt and put their experiences with Roosevelt down on paper. And they never talk about Roosevelt saying, the meaning of life is this. These are my hopes, these are my dreams, these are the things where life has not lived up to my expectations. There's none of that. Roosevelt, to all appearances, lived outwardly at this very superficial level. So, I'm trying to figure out, so where is the real Roosevelt? Where is the rosebud in Roosevelt? And I concluded, when I just watched this guy perform as president, that he really was one of these people who felt more himself on stage than he did in his own private study or office. And Roosevelt was constantly on stage. It's no coincidence that once he was elected president, the American people didn't realize it at the time, but they had elected a president for life. He was elected once, twice, 3 times, a 4th time he died in office. Now, he didn't know he was going to die in office when he was elected in 1932, but he certainly showed no signs of wanting to give up the presidency. I'm going to say in the book that if not for the coming of the war in Europe in 1939, that Roosevelt would not have won a 3rd term, and I think that's true. I'm not sure at all, however, that Roosevelt wouldn't have tried for a 3rd term. Because if he left the White House, then he really would have had to deal with his personal life. And being an ex-president is a tough thing. It's hard enough for anybody. Bill Clinton's trying to find a role for himself. But for somebody like Franklin Roosevelt, who was able to deal with the personal issues of his life by looking ahead and looking up, to have to look back and look down, because anything after the White House is a letdown of sorts. What would he do? And the fact is, he never had to figure that out because he figured out how to stay in office for the rest of his life.